There's a lot of confusion around Matthew 24, and the goal of this video is to make Matthew 24 clear for everybody. I'm Nathaniel Brill, and I think that the view that I'll be proposing today and explaining is the best view that you can have to explain Matthew 24 and really gets across the authorial intent. So here are some other views that I want to compare it with first, some of the most popular. First, there's the futurist view. Futurist view says that everything that occurs in Matthew 24 is yet to occur. It'll all happen in the future. That is, all the destruction and the coming of the Son of Man, these are all future events. Then there's the preterist view. A preterist is someone who prioritizes the past. Usually it's partial preterists that are regarded as Christian. A full preterist is an entirely different view. But the preterists will say that everything that occurs in Matthew 24 has already occurred. It occurred in, or leading up to and at 70 AD when the Romans attacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Then there's the false prophet view. This is the view that atheist scholars like Bart Ehrman will have. They'll say, well, yes, it occurs leading up to and at 70 AD with the destruction of the temple. And then you have Jesus talking about the coming of the Son of Man, and Bart Ehrman would say, he was supposed to come, and he didn't, so he's a false prophet. Now the preterist will say, when Jesus comes at 70 AD, it's not the second coming, it's a coming in judgment. So it's entirely different. And then there's a view which Michael Jones at Inspiring Philosophy shares. I don't know the name of the view, but it's a good view, and he's got a good channel. So his view is that, yes, it occurs at 70 AD, and then there's the coming of the Son of Man, which Jesus did say would occur with what happens in 70 AD, but it was a conditional prophecy, and that we should understand prophecies as conditional by default unless stated otherwise, which there are a lot of conditional prophecies. That makes sense. Now, this is my view. I didn't come up with my view, but I did come up with this name because I like the name. It's the differentiating view. So, yes, it occurs in 70 AD, leading up to and at the destruction of the temple. And then you have the coming of the Son of Man, which does not occur near 70 AD, and Jesus is pulling these two events apart because the apostles think they'll occur together, and Jesus is making it clear, no, these events happen separately. Okay? So let's get into our introduction and look at how Jesus sets up Matthew 24. So let's start in Matthew 23, verse 34. Therefore, behold, I am sending you, he's talking to the Pharisees, I'm sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them you will kill and crucify, and some of them you will scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city. And then verse 36, he says, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. You can remember that reference to this generation. And then in verse 38, he says, behold, your house is being left to you desolate. For I say to you, from now on you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now in chapter 24, Jesus came out from the temple, and he was going away with his disciples, and they were pointing out the temple and buildings to him. And he said to them, do you not see all these things? Truly I say to you, not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. And then as he's sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples come up to him and ask him privately, tell us, when will these things happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and at the end of the age? So Jesus has told the Pharisees, I'm going to send you prophets and you're going to kill them. All these things will come upon this generation. And then he says, your house is being left to you desolate, and you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. The apostles are concerned with this, your house is being left to you desolate talk. And so they're pointing out the temple buildings to him, and Jesus clarifies. Yes, when I said your house is being left to you desolate, I want to make it clear, not one stone here will be left upon another. The entire temple is going to be destroyed. So your house is being left to you desolate. It's talking about the destruction of the temple. And then in verse 39, you will not see me until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. He's talked about the destruction of the temple and the coming of the Son of Man in one breath. And this leads to the apostles' question, which is, when will these things happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, they think that these two events happen together, which is reasonable because one, Jesus mentioned them in the same breath, and two, they're basing this off of their understanding of the Old Testament, which has passages like Zechariah 14, 1-4, which says that God will gather the armies and they will come and fight against Jerusalem. Then the Lord will come and fight for Jerusalem, and then he will stand on the Mount of Olives, which will split and go east to west, and the people in Jerusalem can flee to him. So you have Jerusalem being attacked in Zechariah 14, 1-4. That correlates with a destruction of the temple. That's a reasonable time for the temple to be destroyed, when all the nations are coming against Jerusalem in war. And then you have the second coming, which is talked about right after that in Zechariah. So that makes sense. That's why they understand these two things together, and that led to their question. So that is our introduction. Verses 34 to verse 3 in chapter 24. Now, he's talking about the coming of the Son of Man and the destruction of the temple, which who knows when these things occur, but at least the sending you prophets and wise men and scribes, that is going to occur with these Pharisees. So that's going to occur in their day, with understanding that he's referencing things he's going to talk about later. Let's say that this occurs at or before 70 AD. The sending of the prophets and how the Pharisees are going to kill them, all these things coming upon this generation, as he says in 23 verse 36. Now, what we want to be careful about is we don't want to read the passage and see events that happen and ask, okay, when do I think that happened? Okay, that must be what he has in mind. That's when he was talking about. If we want to understand a prophecy correctly, we need to understand what the author meant by it to his audience. So let's not take a position from 2000 AD and say, when did this happen? That's what it was about. Because that can lead to us misinterpreting it if we don't understand what he's talking about correctly. So let's stick to time indicators in the text and let those tell us, when does he think these things are going to occur? And then after that, that context can tell us his intention. So, our next section, starting in verse 4, Jesus answers the apostles. Jesus answered and said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. Many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not frightened. These things must take place, but that is not yet the end. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes. These are all merely the beginning of birth pangs. They will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you. You will be hated by all nations because of my name. Many will fall away and betray one another. Many false prophets will arise. Because of lawlessness increasing, people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. Okay, so we have a time indicator here. In our introduction, Jesus told the Pharisees that he would send them prophets, and those Pharisees would kill those prophets. And here, Jesus is telling the apostles, I'm going to send you out, they're his prophets, and they're going to deliver you to tribulation and kill you. So what happens in the introduction is happening here but he's talking to a different group. He tells the Pharisees, you're going to kill the people I send. And then he tells the apostles, I'm going to send you and they're going to kill you. So he's talking about the same thing. So 70 AD was what he was talking about for our introduction, because he's talking to those Pharisees and he's talking to the apostles here. He's talking about the same event. So this is our build-up. It goes to verse 14. And this also occurs in 70 AD. By looking at the introduction and these verses, we were able to get a time indicator. He's talking about the same event twice. So we can tell that this is part of the build-up to 70 AD. It's not 70 AD itself yet, because he hasn't described anything about 70 AD yet. It's just the build-up. It's what's going to happen in their lives. Okay, that's our second section. Verse 15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. Remember that people are fleeing. That will be relevant later. Whoever is in the housetop must not go down. Whoever is in the field must not turn back. Woe to those who are pregnant and nursing. Pray that your flight will not be in the winter or on Sabbath. There will be a great tribulation, such as not has occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. Then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or there he is, do not believe him. For false Christs and false prophets will arise and will show great signs and wonders, so as to mislead, if possible, even the elect. Behold, I have told you in advance. So if they say to you, behold, he is in the wilderness, do not go out, or behold, he is in the inner rooms, do not believe them. For just as lightning comes from the east and flashes even to the west, so will the coming of the Son of Man be. Wherever the corpse is, there the vultures will gather. Okay, so he contrasts most of what he's talking about with something at the end. So because he's contrasting something, it's not going to be a clean divide of one section to the next section, but he's talking to the apostles, talking about what they will see. It's hard to say when this following contrast will be, just based off what we have, because he's saying you'll see false prophets, and when the Son of Man comes, it'll be like lightning that flashes from the east even to the west. So let's write down this section. It's not labeled yet. To verse 28. Let's put question marks here, because it looks like it's about what's happening in 70 AD. I mean, you have an abomination of desolation there in 70 AD. And he's talking to the apostles. And it might include the coming of the Son of Man. He contrasts them at the end there. Let's write that down. False prophets versus obvious and instant. And those are verses 26 and 27. There will be false prophets in verse 26, and in verse 27, Jesus makes it clear it'll be like lightning, instant and obvious to everyone. Okay, so let's remember that as we go to verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light. Moving on to verse 30. And the sign of the Son of Man will appear in the sky, then all of the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds with power and great glory. And he will send forth his angels with a great trumpet, and they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of the sky to the other. Okay, we have another contrast there. Because earlier in this section, we had people fleeing. Verse 16, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. And then in verse 31, he says, when the Son of Man comes, he's going to gather his elect from the four winds. So let's write that down. It's verse 16. Yeah. So fleeing in verse 16 versus being gathered in verse 31. Let's write down this section as Son of Man coming. And don't know yet, so let's put question marks. Then we get the parable of the fig tree. Now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and put forth its leaves, you know that the summer is near. So you too, when you see all these things, recognize he is near, right at the door. So all these things, is he talking about everything he's talked about so far? No, because what you're recognizing is that he is near. That's the coming of the Son of Man. So when he says, when you see all these things, he's talking about all the other things, not the coming of the Son of Man. If he was including the Son of Man, then he'd be saying, when you see all these things like the coming of the Son of Man, that's a sign that the coming of the Son of Man is near. It just doesn't work. So when you see all these things, recognize he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation, that goes back to our intro too, because in verse 36, he said, truly I say to you, all these things will come upon this generation. So verse 34, truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Okay, so we have some time indicators. The fig tree section. Verse 32. Let's cut that off at 36, because then he gets into parables. This is part of the build-up to 70 AD. And there's another contrast here. He says this generation is going to include all these things that occur, but when the Son of Man comes, he doesn't know. So there's another contrast. This generation versus nobody knows the hour. Okay. And because these things are occurring in this generation, and that's all these things except the coming of the Son of Man, because that can't be included, we know that this section, where he's talking about the abomination of desolation, is part of what happens in their generation. So this fits the siege of Jerusalem in 70 AD, because it happens in their generation. But the Son of Man coming is contrasted with what happens in 70 AD with three contrasts. One, there's going to be false prophets there in 70 AD, But that's not what it's going to be like when the Son of Man comes. When the Son of Man comes, it's going to be instant and visible to everyone. So he's disassociating these false prophets from the second coming. And then you're told to flee with the events of 70 AD, but when the Son of Man comes, you're going to be gathered. So that's like, you're running out of the city, and then the Son of Man comes, you're going back. It doesn't really make sense for those to occur right after each other. They're contrasted. So those two go against each other, and then you have a contrast in the parable of the fig tree. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. He's really confident. He knows that this is going to happen this generation. But he contrasts that with verse 36. But of that day and hour no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father alone. Okay, so he knows when the destruction in 70 AD is going to happen. He doesn't know when the coming of the Son of Man is going to occur. So we can firmly put this in the future with the coming of the Son of Man, and that does not fit with 70 AD because it's being contrasted with it. It fits with the second coming. Like is said at Jesus' ascension, when he floats into the clouds, the angel says, you will see him coming in the same way. And he does that from the Mount of Olives, where, like our passage in Zechariah said, that's where the feet of the Lord shall stand when he splits the Mount of Olives and people can flee out of Jerusalem. So the coming of the Son of Man, that is a second coming event, and the destruction in 70 AD is what the rest of this is talking about. Now, just so that we're following his train of thought, he's talking about the destruction in 70 AD, and then he talks about the coming of the Son of Man. He contrasts it, and then he says all these things. And we know that that can't include the coming of the Son of Man because it breaks the logic of the verse. But following his train of thought, why does he say all these things in a way that does not include the Son of Man? Is he just talking in an unclear way? Well, by a point of comparison, let's say that you just went to the store and you bought some groceries. You come home and you get in a dispute with your spouse. If you didn't have a spouse before, you have one now because of this example. Congratulations. So you get in a dispute with your spouse because they said, you didn't get eggs. And you said, well, I got everything that was on the list. And she says, but we always need to get eggs. And you're like, wait. When I got all the things, it was okay because I was getting what I was told to get. Now you just said all the things, and you were talking about eggs. How could you not include those? It's because the eggs are being contrasted with everything else that you actually did get. So when there's a contrast, that's why you can say things like, when all these things occur, and not include something you already said, because it's being contrasted with everything else you're talking about. So not only is it impossible that when he said all these things, he's talking about the second coming, it fits his train of thought, because these are not associated events. These are contrasted events. Under other views, when he says all these things, it kind of doesn't really make sense why he would say that, including the Son of Man passage, which he was just talking about, because there's no contrast. He's just talking about things, including the second coming, and then he says all these things, not including the second coming. It makes less sense than if these are being contrasted, because then that actually fits the flow of thought. So, what about what happens in the passages? If we've identified time frames that these must occur in, aren't there problematic verses that someone could use to argue against this? Yes. So the futurist has a tendency to say, these things have not occurred, therefore they must yet still need to occur. So they'll point to things like the gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all the nations, and then the end will come. So, has the gospel of the kingdom been preached to the whole world? Well, by 70 AD, it was preached to the whole known world. Went all across Rome, went into Africa. If you believe the church fathers about Thomas, he went to India. Some will even say that Paul went all the way to England. I don't know if I buy that, but Spain is a more common view. He went all the way to Spain. And even the Table of Nations in Genesis 10, the gospel went everywhere included in there. Some people find that a big deal. So, yeah, the gospel went to the whole world. If I said something needs to happen for the whole world, and then later we find out that there are people living in underground caverns way below the surface of the earth, it would be safe to assume that I just wasn't talking about them. So it's perfectly natural with the way that people talk that he wasn't including Australia and America. He was talking about his known world. That doesn't mean that you have to read it that way, but if our context is suggesting that the time frame this occurs in is building up to 70 AD, then it's perfectly natural to read it as their known world. Okay. Any other problematic verses? What about, there will be such a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. That can be hyperbole. He's talking to the people who will experience it. If our time indicators suggest that the author of the book views these as occurring as build up to or as the actual event in 70 AD, then even if you don't read it that way on first reading, it's good to understand that it can easily be hyperbole. People exaggerate terrible events all the time, especially that they are going to experience, or if they're talking to the person who will experience them. Hyperbole is fair game. Then we get to verse 29, the word immediately. And this is one of the most problematic words for the view. This will influence the futurist, preterist, false prophet, and the view that Michael Jones shares. That they view the second coming, the coming of the Son of Man, as needing to occur with whatever the rest of the passage is about, because it says immediately. Now, the word immediately does have some flex, like when Jesus is talking about the parable of the sower. He casts the seeds into the shallow soil, and they spring up immediately. He's not meaning to be describing a miracle. He's meaning to be saying that they arose relatively quickly, and this is the next thing that happened. He's not going to describe a 24-hour wait. So it may not be the first reading that someone has when they come across the word immediately there, but when you understand the context and that these things are being contrasted, it's within the realm of meaning, and seems to be how you should take it. That this immediately refers to this is the next thing on the list, rather than the next second or minute. So that's Matthew. Mark is very similar in how it's set up. It has its introduction, build up to the siege of Jerusalem, the events that actually happened when the Romans attacked Jerusalem, a passage on the Son of Man coming, and your passage with the fig tree. And all of these contrasts are present that make it clear that these are two separate events. Each time Jesus contrasts the two, he's making it clear these are not the same event. Mark is just missing a few verses that add a little clarity, so Matthew is a little clearer than Mark, but everything still applies to Mark. Now, Luke is a little bit different than Mark and Matthew, because Luke has separated this speech in Matthew 24 into two separate passages. One in Luke 17, which is a little different. It's only about the coming of the Son of Man, though the preterist would say it's also only about the destruction in 70 AD. And then Luke has a passage later, which is much more like what is in Mark and Matthew, with less information, because he hoped to add clarity by making it be one section about the coming of the Son of Man, and then one section that has less mixed verses. So in chapter 17, verse 20 of Luke, he says, "Now having been questioned by the Pharisees as to when the kingdom of God was coming, he answered them and said, 'The kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed.'" Okay, that fits this, that it's going to be obvious and instant. And it doesn't fit with 70 AD, because he's saying there's going to be buildup. You're going to see this coming. And it's going to happen in this generation. He's saying there are signs to be observed when he's giving the parable of the fig tree. And he's saying there's not signs to be observed in that it's going to be obvious and instant. And he's reiterating that here in Luke, that the kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed. Nor will they say, "Look, here it is," or "There it is. For behold, the kingdom of God is in your midst." Which some people might take that to mean, behold, it's already been in your midst. But since he's talking about the immediacy and the instantaneous nature of his coming, it makes more sense to take that as, behold, it just showed up. It's here in my midst. Okay, so you get a lot of descriptions that are shared by Matthew and Mark that are about the coming of the Son of Man in Luke. But then you get to verse 31. "On that day, the one who is on the housetop and whose goods are in the house must not go down to take them out, and likewise the one who is in the field must not turn back." Now this verse in Matthew and Luke is in this section with the siege of Jerusalem. It is not about the coming of the Son of Man. So how can this section be just about the coming of the Son of Man? Well, this verse is sandwiched with Jesus comparing the coming of the Son of Man with Noah, which that's what happens right after this fig tree parable, when he gets into parables that every view recognizes this is about the second coming. And if our contrasts have led us to believe that by that point he is talking about the second coming, then this passage is sandwiched with verses that are definitely about the coming of the Son of Man. So how does this verse fit? Well, this isn't the first time that a verse is given a different context, like with Matthew, when Jesus says, when you pray a mountain can be moved, they're at Mount Zion. And when that happens in Mark, they're at Mount Hebron. And when that happens in Luke, it's not a mountain, it's a mulberry tree. So they're okay with moving verses and changing the context a little so that they fit the message that they're trying to convey. So here, this is an equally true statement when applied to the second coming. Comparing it to Zechariah again, Jerusalem is being attacked, and you do flee Jerusalem to Jesus, who gathers you when he lands on the Mount of Olives. So it's a valid statement there. Luke just put it in this context to try and be clear about the message that he is delivering. But if we try and make this about the destruction in 70 AD, then we're trying to stretch our harmonization a bit too far, I think, and it just confuses the whole chapter of Luke 17. And it doesn't fit at all with the fact that the coming of the Son of Man and the destruction in 70 AD are being contrasted. So rather than saying this whole chapter must somehow be about the destruction in 70 AD, I think the better explanation is that Luke thought that this verse was a good description of the coming of the Son of Man as well, and fit in this context. Okay? So, the apostles think that the destruction of the temple in 70 AD and the coming of the Son of Man are the same event, which they understand is the second coming. Jesus never corrects them that the coming of the Son of Man is not the second coming. He's in on that, and yes, the destruction of the temple is the other event in view, which happens in their lifetime. We've made that clear. And Jesus makes it clear that these events do not happen together like the apostles thought. He's clarifying their theology. Yes, you will have destruction events at the second coming when all the nations of the earth are attacking Jerusalem, like it says in Zechariah 14. But this destruction of the temple that Jesus is talking about is not going to be associated with the coming of the Son of Man. He makes that perfectly clear by saying it'll happen in this generation, but I don't know when the coming of the Son of Man will be. When the destruction of the temple happens, you need to flee, but when I'm going to gather you when I show up. And by saying there's going to be false prophets, but they are not associated with the coming of the Son of Man, which is going to be instant. And again, there's going to be signs leading up to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. When you see that the fig tree is ripe, you know. But there will be no signs leading up to the coming of the Son of Man, which will be obvious and instant. Okay, so that's why I call it the differentiating view, because the apostles think they go together, and Jesus contrasts them a few times to pull them apart. Okay? Thank you.